Welcome to Case 404. When we think of true crime, our minds naturally gravitate toward the shadows. We picture the stranger lurking in the dark alleyway, the masked intruder breaking through a window in the dead of night, or the calculating serial killer hunting their prey on desolate highways. We are conditioned to look for monsters on the outside. But what happens when the monster is not a stranger? What happens when the greatest threat to your existence is the very person who gave you life? What happens when the architect of your suffering is the one society universally views as your ultimate protector? Today we open a file that defies every fundamental instinct of human nature. This is not a story of a sudden violent attack. It is a story of a slow, agonizing, and meticulously calculated psychological and physical torture that lasted for more than 2 decades, carried out in plain sight, applauded by the community and funded by charity. This is the horrifying reality of the Gypsy Rose Blanchard case. To understand the sheer magnitude of this deception, we must first travel to Springfield, Missouri, to a quaint, perfectly painted house with a wheelchair ramp leading up to the front door. This house, built by Habitat for Humanity, was a symbol of a community's love and support. Inside lived Claudine Blanchard, known to everyone as Dee Dee, and her deeply disabled, chronically ill daughter, Gypsy Rose. To the outside world, Dee Dee was the ultimate martyr. She was a single mother who had dedicated every waking second of her life to caring for a child who had been dealt the most devastating hand by fate. If you asked Dee Dee what was wrong with Gypsy, she would rattle off a medical chart that sounded like an absolute death sentence. According to Dee Dee, Gypsy suffered from leukemia, a cancer of the blood, which required harrowing treatments that left the little girl bald. But the cancer was just the beginning. Gypsy supposedly had muscular dystrophy, a degenerative disease that robbed her of the ability to walk, confining her permanently to a wheelchair. She had severe asthma requiring breathing machines. She suffered from sleep apnea so dangerous she needed a monitor to ensure she didn't stop breathing in the night. She had epilepsy, experiencing terrifying seizures that required heavy, mind-numbing medication. She had a chromosomal defect that supposedly gave her the mental capacity of a 7-year-old child. And because her body was allegedly failing to absorb nutrients, Gypsy was fed through a surgical tube inserted directly into her stomach. When people looked at Gypsy, they saw a fragile, high-pitched, bald child in a pink wheelchair, clutching a stuffed animal, her frail body swamped by oversized clothes, wearing thick glasses and smiling weakly at the camera. And when they looked at Dee Dee, they saw a saint. They saw a woman who smiled through the tears, who held her daughter's hand through endless hospital visits, and who asked for nothing but prayers. The community and the nation rushed to embrace them. The Blanchard family became a beacon for charitable organizations. Make-A-Wish sent them on all-expenses-paid trips to Disney World. Ronald McDonald House provided them with shelter and support during their countless medical excursions. Miranda Lambert, the famous country singer, sent them thousands of dollars. Local communities rallied to buy them a specialized van capable of transporting Gypsy's wheelchair. They received free flights, backstage passes to concerts, and an outpouring of financial donations from kind-hearted strangers who just wanted to ease the burden of a dying girl and her heroic mother. But there was a dark, sickening secret hidden behind the closed doors of that pink house in Springfield. The entire narrative, every single illness, every seizure, every symptom, was an absolute, fabricated lie. Gypsy Rose Blanchard did not have cancer. She never had leukemia. She did not have muscular dystrophy. Her legs worked perfectly fine. She was entirely capable of walking, running, and jumping. She did not have severe asthma or sleep apnea. She was not mentally disabled. Her brain was functioning perfectly, trapped in a nightmare of her mother's creation. The only thing truly sick in that house was Dee Dee Blanchard. Dee Dee suffered from a severe psychological condition known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy, clinically referred to as factitious disorder imposed on another. It is a terrifying mental illness where a caregiver, almost always a mother, makes up or causes an illness or injury in a person under their care, such as a child, an elderly adult, or a person who has a disability. The motive is not financial gain, although that often becomes a byproduct. The primary motive is the addiction to the attention, the sympathy, and the praise that comes from playing the role of the devoted, self-sacrificing caregiver. Dee Dee did not want a healthy, independent daughter. A healthy daughter would eventually grow up, leave home, and strip Dee Dee of her identity as the tragic, heroic mother. She needed Gypsy to be sick. She needed Gypsy to be helpless. She needed Gypsy to be entirely dependent on her for survival. But how does a mother convince the entire medical establishment, highly trained doctors, and pediatric specialists that a perfectly healthy child is dying of multiple terminal diseases? How does she fake cancer? The answer lies in a masterclass of manipulation, geographical evasion, and the dark exploitation of the medical system's inherent trust. Dee Dee was a chameleon of deception. She utilized a tactic known as doctor shopping. If a doctor began to grow suspicious, if test results consistently came back normal and the physician suggested that Gypsy might not be as sick as Dee Dee claimed, Dee Dee would immediately become defensive, accuse the doctor of incompetence, and never return to that hospital. She would pack up her daughter and move to a new doctor in a new city or a new state, starting the narrative all over again. Furthermore, Dee Dee had the perfect, tragic excuse for her lack of verifiable medical history. The Blanchards originally hailed from Louisiana. When Hurricane Katrina devastated the region in 2005, it provided Dee Dee with a golden opportunity. She claimed that all of Gypsy's original medical records, the vital documents that would have proven she was born healthy, were destroyed in the catastrophic flooding. It was a lie that no one dared to question. Who would demand proof from a destitute mother who had just lost her home to one of the deadliest hurricanes in American history? Without prior records to contradict her, doctors had to rely on Dee Dee's meticulous, entirely fabricated medical history. And the doctors, trained to listen to the mother and treat the symptoms presented, prescribed a horrific cocktail of unnecessary and deeply damaging treatments. This was not just a psychological prison, it was a physical torture chamber sanctioned by the medical community. Gypsy was subjected to dozens of agonizing, entirely unnecessary surgeries. Because Dee Dee claimed Gypsy suffered from severe gastroesophageal reflux and could not swallow properly, doctors surgically inserted a feeding tube into her stomach. 4 years, a perfectly healthy girl was fed a liquid diet through a plastic tube protruding from her abdomen, while she was entirely capable of eating regular food. Because Dee Dee claimed Gypsy suffered from sleep apnea, doctors surgically removed her adenoids. When Dee Dee claimed Gypsy's salivary glands were overactive, causing her to drool, doctors injected her glands with Botox, and eventually surgically removed them entirely. The physical toll of the lies was devastating. The medications Dee Dee forced Gypsy to take, heavy tranquilizers, anti-seizure medications, and powerful painkillers for conditions she never had, caused Gypsy's teeth to rot and crumble. Rather than stopping the medications, Dee Dee had Gypsy's teeth surgically extracted. The beautiful smile of a young girl was replaced by a tragic, gummy grin, further enhancing the illusion of severe, degenerative illness. Dee Dee even regularly shaved Gypsy's head to maintain the illusion that she was undergoing chemotherapy for the leukemia she never had. For the first decade and a half of her life, Gypsy knew nothing else. She was conditioned to believe she was sick. When your mother, the person who provides your food, your shelter, and your only connection to the outside world, tells you that you are dying, you believe her. When doctors in white coats put you under anesthesia and cut you open, you believe you must be broken. Gypsy lived in a state of absolute, manufactured fragility. She was not allowed to speak during medical appointments. Dee Dee would squeeze her hand tightly, a silent, painful warning to stay quiet while her mother recited the fabricated symptoms to the doctors. But as the years dragged on, the cracks in the pink facade began to slowly fracture. Biology is an unstoppable force. Gypsy was growing up. Despite Dee Dee's desperate attempts to keep her daughter infantile, dressing her in princess costumes, forcing her to watch cartoons, and altering the date on her birth certificate to make her appear years younger than she actually was, Gypsy's mind was maturing. In the quiet, lonely hours of the night, when Dee Dee was finally asleep, the heavy, suffocating veil of deception began to lift. Gypsy realized a terrifying, undeniable truth. When she was alone in her room, safely out of her mother's suffocating gaze, she would carefully slide out of her wheelchair. Her feet would touch the floor. Her muscles would engage, and she would walk. She was not paralyzed. Her legs worked. She could breathe on her own. She could eat on her own. The realization was not a moment of joyous liberation. It was an avalanche of psychological horror. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was a prisoner of war, and her captor was sleeping in the very next room. As Gypsy reached her late teens and early 20s, an age she was completely unaware of due to her mother's lies, her desire for freedom, for love, and for a normal life began to violently clash with the horrific reality of her imprisonment. She was trapped in a wheelchair she didn't need, fed through a tube she didn't require, and drugged with medications that were destroying her body. She had no money, no friends, no education, and no connection to the outside world, save for one crucial hidden lifeline: the internet. Late at night, under the glow of a computer screen, Gypsy began to quietly explore a world where she wasn't a dying child. It was in this digital shadow realm that she would meet a man who would listen to her darkest secrets. It was here, trapped in a house of horrific medical abuse, that a desperate, terrifying plan would begin to form. If her mother would not let her live, Gypsy realized that one of them would have to die. In the suffocating, artificially pink world of the Blanchard home, the nights were the only sanctuary for Gypsy Rose. When the sun went down and Dee Dee finally fell asleep, the house fell into a heavy, oppressive silence. But in the dark of her bedroom, bathed in the pale blue glow of a laptop screen, the sick, wheelchair-bound girl ceased to exist. In the digital shadows of the internet, Gypsy was not a cancer patient. She was not a tragic victim with the mental capacity of a 7-year-old. She was a young, desperate woman, fully aware of her physical capabilities, searching frantically for a lifeline to pull her out of a living nightmare. Because Dee Dee monitored her every waking move, confiscating cell phones and smashing computers if she suspected rebellion, Gypsy's online life had to be a masterpiece of digital espionage. She created secret accounts, logging on only when her mother's deep snoring echoed through the hallway. It was in one of these clandestine digital excursions, on a Christian dating website of all places, that Gypsy's desperate search for a savior collided with a mind as fractured and dangerous as her own mother's. Enter Nicholas Gojan. Nick was a 23-year-old man from Big Bend, Wisconsin. To the outside world, he was socially awkward, isolated, and struggled with a myriad of psychological issues, including a history of public indecency and a diagnosed autism spectrum disorder. But to Gypsy, Nick was everything she had ever dreamed of. He was her Prince Charming, a knight in tarnished armor who listened to her, who validated her, and who, most importantly, believed her when she confessed the darkest secret of her life. She was not sick, and her mother was holding her hostage. Their online relationship escalated with terrifying speed. They bonded over their mutual isolation, two broken outcasts finding solace in a digital fantasy world. But Nick's fantasy world was exceptionally dark. He claimed to have multiple personalities, some of which were violent, sadistic, and deeply immersed in a macabre subculture of blood and power. Rather than running away from this darkness, Gypsy leaned into it. She needed a monster to fight the monster sleeping in the next room. For 2 years, their relationship existed entirely in the digital realm. They exchanged thousands of messages, their conversations morphing from awkward romance to a deeply disturbing, codependent obsession. Gypsy, starved of any normal human interaction and completely devoid of a moral compass due to her lifelong isolation, began to see Nick not just as a boyfriend but as a weapon. The tipping point arrived when Dee Dee's abuse escalated from medical torture to physical restraint. As Gypsy grew older and more rebellious, attempting to escape the house on foot, Dee Dee's methods of control became increasingly draconian. When Gypsy tried to run away, Dee Dee chained her to the bed for 2 weeks. She placed bells on the doors so she could hear if Gypsy tried to leave. She starved her, she hit her with coat hangers, and she threatened to take a hammer to Gypsy's fingers if she ever tried to expose the truth. Gypsy realized with a chilling absolute certainty that Dee Dee would never let her go. If she tried to leave, Dee Dee would drag her back. If she went to the police, Dee Dee, the master manipulator who had fooled the entire medical establishment, would simply convince the authorities that Gypsy was mentally incompetent. In Gypsy's traumatized, isolated mind, the walls were closing in, and there was only one permanent, bloody exit. The plan was not born of a sudden fit of rage. It was a cold, calculated conspiracy hatched over text messages and private chats. Gypsy would provide the logistics, and Nick, channeling his violent alter ego, would execute the deed. In June 2015, the digital fantasy bled into terrifying reality. Gypsy stole money from her mother to pay for Nick's bus ticket from Wisconsin to Missouri. The anticipation leading up to the murder was an agonizing countdown. On the night of June 9th, Dee Dee went to sleep, completely unaware that the daughter she had tortured, drugged, and infantilized for 23 years had just unlocked the front door of their pink house. Nick Gojan arrived under the cover of darkness. He entered the home, slipping quietly into the hallway. Gypsy met him in the dark. She handed him the weapon, a serrated hunting knife she had previously purchased during a rare, unsupervised moment at a local store. She also handed him a pair of blue latex gloves. The instructions were brutally clear. Gypsy did not want to see it happen. She retreated to the bathroom, closed the door, and crouched on the floor, pressing her hands tightly over her ears. She listened to the agonizing silence of the house, waiting for the sound that would sever her chains forever. In the bedroom, Nick approached the sleeping Dee Dee. The woman who had successfully deceived the world for decades was entirely defenseless. What happened next was a frenzy of brutal, intimate violence. Nick stabbed Dee Dee 17 times in the back and neck. The struggle was violent but brief. From behind the closed bathroom door, Gypsy could hear her mother scream her name, a desperate, final plea for the daughter she had imprisoned. But Gypsy did not open the door. She stayed on the floor, her hands pressed over her ears, until the screaming stopped and the heavy, terrifying silence returned to the house. When Gypsy finally emerged, the architect of her suffering was dead. The pink house, once a beacon of fraudulent charity, was now a slaughterhouse. There was no time for mourning. There was only the frantic adrenaline of escape. Gypsy and Nick quickly cleaned the scene as best they could. Gypsy, showing a chilling level of composure, went into her mother's safe and took $4,000 in cash, money that had been donated by kind strangers to help the dying girl. They packed their bags, and for the first time in her adult life, Gypsy walked out the front door on her own 2 feet. She didn't need the wheelchair. She didn't need the oxygen tanks. She didn't need the feeding tubes. She walked to a local motel with Nick, and the next day they boarded a bus to Wisconsin, leaving the bloody nightmare of Springfield far behind. But how do you explain the sudden disappearance of a profoundly disabled, high-profile charity case and her devoted mother? Gypsy knew that if they simply vanished, the police would eventually break down the door. But she made a critical, psychological miscalculation. She wanted the body to be found quickly, perhaps out of a twisted sense of guilt, or perhaps to ensure Dee Dee couldn't somehow come back to life and drag her back. From Nick's home in Wisconsin, days after the murder, Gypsy logged into the shared Facebook account she held with her mother, an account followed by thousands of sympathetic supporters. She typed a single vulgar and utterly shocking sentence that would instantly shatter the illusion of the Blanchard family and trigger a nationwide manhunt. "That bee is dead." The post hit the internet like a bomb. The followers of the page, people who had prayed for Gypsy and donated their hard-earned money, were thrown into a state of absolute panic. At first, they thought the account had been hacked. But when a second, even more disturbing comment was posted from the account, claiming that Dee Dee had been slashed and Gypsy had been assaulted, the community's panic turned into a frantic 911 call. Local police arrived at the pink house on Volunteer Way. The house was locked, the van was in the driveway, and the wheelchair was inside. When officers finally breached the property and entered the bedroom, they were met with a horrific scene. Dee Dee Blanchard was lying face down on her bed, surrounded by a pool of dried blood. But the most terrifying discovery was what they didn't find. Gypsy Rose, the fragile, bald, wheelchair-bound girl who supposedly couldn't survive a single day without her mother's intensive medical care, was gone. The immediate assumption by the police, the media, and the entire nation was a terrifying one. A deeply disabled, dying girl had been abducted by a violent psychopath who had murdered her mother. The clock was ticking. The authorities believed Gypsy was in imminent, life-threatening danger without her medications and her feeding tube. A massive, desperate search operation was launched. News anchors broadcasted Gypsy's face across the country, pleading for the safe return of the sick child. But modern criminal investigations do not rely solely on physical footprints. They follow digital ghosts. Detectives quickly traced the IP address of the shocking Facebook post. The digital trail bypassed the local area entirely, shooting hundreds of miles north, directly to a small, unassuming house in Big Bend, Wisconsin. The address belonged to Nicholas Gojon. Heavily armed tactical teams surrounded the Wisconsin home. They prepared for a hostage rescue, fully expecting to find a terrified, medically fragile girl fighting for her life, or worse, another body. They breached the doors and secured the suspects. But when the detectives walked into the room to identify the kidnapped victim, the entire foundation of the case and everything the world thought they knew about the Blanchards violently collapsed. Sitting in the police station was a healthy, vibrant young woman with a full head of hair. She wasn't wearing a pink princess dress. She was dressed like a normal teenager. She didn't have an oxygen tank. She didn't have a feeding tube. And most shockingly of all, when she stood up to be escorted to the interrogation room, she walked perfectly fine. The fragile, dying girl the entire country was searching for had never existed. The victim was a phantom, the mother was a monster, and the kidnapping was an illusion to cover up a brutal, calculated matricide. The interrogation tapes would soon reveal a story so twisted, so profoundly disturbing, that it would force the justice system to question the very nature of guilt, victimhood, and the absolute limits of human endurance. The interrogation room in Waukesha County, Wisconsin, was a stark, sterile, and cold contrast to the artificially pink, suffocating walls of the Blanchard house in Missouri. Detectives sat across the metal table, staring intensely at a young woman who completely defied every single report, medical chart, and missing person poster they had just read. The police files described a terminally ill, wheelchair-bound, cognitively impaired child who was clinging to life. The person sitting before them was a 23-year-old adult. She was not wearing a bright pink princess costume. She was not hooked up to a breathing machine. Her head was not bald from chemotherapy, but covered in a short, growing layer of natural hair. And most astoundingly, she had walked into the room entirely on her own 2 feet. The fragile, dying girl that the entire nation was desperately searching for was an absolute, manufactured phantom. As Gypsy Rose Blanchard began to speak, the horrifying tapestry of her lifelong imprisonment slowly unraveled before the stunned detectives. She confessed to the murder plot, but her confession was buried beneath 2 decades of systematic, unimaginable medical torture. She detailed the unnecessary surgeries, the feeding tubes, the teeth that were surgically extracted because of rotting caused by unnecessary medications, and the heavy chains her mother used to tie her to the bed when she tried to escape. The detectives, hardened veterans of homicide investigations, found themselves listening to a psychological horror story that eclipsed any standard murder case. They had found the killers, but they had also found a victim who had been held hostage in plain sight for her entire existence. When the truth hit the public sphere, the reaction was a seismic cultural shift of unprecedented proportions. The nation had been mourning a murdered saint of a mother and praying for a kidnapped, dying girl. In a matter of 48 hours, the narrative violently inverted. The murdered saint was exposed as a sadistic, manipulative abuser suffering from severe Munchausen syndrome by proxy. The kidnapped, dying girl was revealed to be a physically healthy, desperate hostage who had conspired to butcher her own mother. The public was thrown into a state of intense moral confusion. The internet, which had previously showered the Blanchards with donations and prayers, erupted into a massive, polarizing debate. Was Gypsy Rose a cold-blooded, calculating murderer who manipulated a mentally unstable man into doing her dirty work? Or was she the ultimate victim of a failed system, a prisoner of war who took the only bloody exit available to survive? The medical community faced a devastating, highly public reckoning. How did a single mother fool dozens of highly trained specialists, pediatricians, and surgeons for 20 years? The case exposed a terrifying blind spot in the modern healthcare system. Doctors are trained to listen to the parents, to trust the symptoms reported by the primary caregiver, and to treat the patient accordingly. Dee Dee Blanchard had weaponized this inherent trust. She exploited the lack of a centralized, national medical database, jumping from hospital to hospital, state to state, erasing her tracks every time a doctor grew suspicious. The medical establishment had unwittingly become an instrument of torture, performing painful, irreversible procedures on a healthy child simply because a deeply disturbed mother demanded it. The charities, from Make-A-Wish to Habitat for Humanity, were forced to grapple with the disturbing reality that their millions of dollars in goodwill had funded and enabled a massive, abusive fraud. But the justice system operates on the cold, hard mechanics of the law, not just human empathy and public outrage. A brutal, premeditated murder had occurred. The legal proceedings that followed highlighted a tragic, controversial disparity in the American justice system, focusing entirely on the 2 individuals involved in the conspiracy: Gypsy Rose Blanchard and Nicholas Godejohn. Nicholas Godejohn, the isolated, mentally struggling young man from Wisconsin who had actually wielded the hunting knife, faced the full, crushing weight of the law. During his trial, his defense attorneys argued that he was a pawn, a man with autism and severe cognitive limitations who was deeply manipulated by Gypsy. They argued he was blinded by a desperate, obsessive love and believed he was rescuing his girlfriend from a life of horrific torture. He believed he was the Dark Knight saving the princess from the dragon. But the prosecution painted a different picture. They focused on the gruesome, premeditated nature of the crime. Nick had traveled across state lines with the explicit intent to kill. He had stabbed a defenseless, sleeping woman 17 times, and he had discussed the murder in chilling, graphic detail in text messages beforehand. The jury was not swayed by the narrative of the tragic rescuer. Nicholas Godejohn was convicted of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will die behind bars for a crime he committed to free a girl he had only met in person once before the night of the murder. Gypsy's legal journey, however, took a drastically different path. The prosecution recognized the absolute, unprecedented level of abuse she had endured. They knew that putting a lifelong victim of Munchausen by proxy on the stand in front of a sympathetic jury could easily result in an acquittal or a hung jury. Seeking a guaranteed conviction while acknowledging the horrific mitigating circumstances, the state offered Gypsy a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. In a courtroom filled with media and captivated onlookers, the judge sentenced her to 10 years in state prison. The disparity in the sentences ignited a firestorm of controversy that still burns today. Critics argued that Gypsy was the true mastermind, the architect of the murder who used a mentally vulnerable man as a weapon to do her bidding, and that 10 years was a shockingly light sentence for orchestrating a brutal homicide. Supporters, however, argued that 10 years was a gross injustice for a woman who had never experienced a single day of true freedom in her life, a victim whose mind was so heavily conditioned by trauma that she saw no other way to survive. In a dark, tragic irony that perfectly encapsulates the absolute horror of her upbringing, Gypsy Rose Blanchard found her first taste of genuine freedom behind the razor wire, steel doors, and concrete walls of the Chillicothe Correctional Center. In prison for the first time in her life, she was not heavily medicated with unnecessary drugs. She was allowed to eat regular food without a feeding tube, and she quickly gained healthy weight. Her hair grew out long and thick. She was not confined to a wheelchair. She interacted with women her own age, forming friendships and participating in educational programs. In interviews conducted from within the prison walls, Gypsy made a statement that chilled the public to the bone. She felt freer in a maximum security prison than she ever did in her mother's pink house. The story of Gypsy Rose Blanchard became a massive, undeniable true crime phenomenon. Documentaries were filmed, a highly dramatized television series called The Act won major awards, and podcasts analyzed every single text message and medical record. Gypsy became a celebrity from behind bars, receiving thousands of letters, marriage proposals, and an army of dedicated online supporters who viewed her as a survivor rather than a killer. While incarcerated, she even met and married a man through a prison pen pal program, securing the romantic future she had so desperately sought on the night of the murder. In late December 2023, after serving exactly 8.5 years of her 10-year sentence, the prison doors swung open. Gypsy Rose Blanchard walked out of the Chillicothe Correctional Center a free woman. But she did not walk into quiet, peaceful obscurity. She walked directly into a blinding media circus. Paparazzi documented her every move. Within hours of her release, she created a TikTok account that amassed millions of followers almost overnight. She began doing press tours, appearing on morning talk shows, walking red carpets, and releasing a new documentary series detailing her life after prison. The public fascination with her had not waned, it had multiplied exponentially. Yet, as the camera flashes fade and the viral trends move on to the next true crime obsession, the core tragedy of the Blanchard house remains a dark, permanent stain on the American consciousness. The case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard forces us to confront the terrifying reality that the most dangerous monsters do not always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they are the ones holding our hands, smiling for the cameras and asking for our prayers. It is a cautionary tale about the deadly consequences of blind trust, the catastrophic failure of the systems designed to protect the vulnerable, and the horrific lengths to which a human being will go when pushed to the absolute limits of psychological and physical survival. The pink house on Volunteer Way may be empty, but the ghosts of the ultimate deception will haunt the annals of true crime forever.